I've been driving trucks through Appalachia for 23 years, and I've seen things on these mountain roads that I can't explain to anyone who hasn't spent nights alone in a cab watching darkness swallow their headlights. You learn to accept certain things when you drive these routes long enough, learn to file away experiences that don't fit into the world you thought you understood, learn to keep quiet about the moments that would make people question your sanity if you ever tried to describe them over coffee or beers, or the ordinary conversations that make up ordinary lives. The night I'm talking about was in October 2019, somewhere on Route 19 inches eastern Kentucky, a stretch of highway that cuts through mountains so steep and forests so thick that your headlights feel like candles trying to illuminate a cathedral. I'd been on the road for 9 hours by then, hauling a load of furniture from a warehouse in Ohio to a distribution center in Tennessee, the kind of routine run I'd done so many times, I could probably drive it in my sleep. Not that I ever would. 23 years teaches you that the moment you get complacent on mountain roads is the moment they kill you. The rain started around midnight, a drizzle at first that I barely noticed, then a steady fall that made me reduce my speed, then a downpour so heavy it felt like driving through a waterfall. My wipers were on their highest setting and still couldn't keep up, smearing water across the windshield faster than they could clear it, turning the road ahead into a blur of red tail lights and white lane markers that appeared and vanished like messages I wasn't quick enough to read. I should have pulled over, should have found a truck stop or a rest area, or even just a wide shoulder where I could wait out the worst of it. But there's something about being alone on a highway at night, something about the isolation and the darkness and the particular loneliness of a cab that's been your only companion for hours that makes you want to keep moving, to get where you're going, to put miles behind you even when the smart thing would be to stop. The section of Route 19 I was on had no truck stops, no rest areas, nothing but trees and guardrails, and the occasional gap in the forest that revealed drops so steep you couldn't see the bottom even in daylight. I'd driven this stretch dozens of times over the years, knew its curves and grades, and the particular way it wound through mountains that had been there since before anyone thought to build roads through them. But that night, in that rain, it felt different. Felt like I was the only person left in a world that had emptied out while I wasn't looking. Like the darkness beyond my headlights wasn't just absence of light, but something more, something that had weight and presence and intention. I saw her around 2 a.m. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks, the way they do when you've been staring at a rain-blurred windshield for too long, and your brain starts filling in patterns that aren't really there. A shape on the shoulder, pale against the darkness, moving with the particular rhythm of someone walking. I blinked, wiped a hand across eyes that felt gritty with exhaustion, looked again. She was still there. A woman walking on the shoulder of the highway in a summer dress that had no business being worn in October, let alone in a rainstorm that was cold enough to see your breath. No coat, no umbrella, no bag or belongings or any of the things a person would carry if they were out in weather like this by choice. Just a woman in a white dress, walking along the side of a mountain highway at 2 a.m. like she was strolling through a park on a sunny afternoon. I slowed down immediately, the reflex of someone who spent 2 decades watching for hazards on roads that produce them constantly. My first thought was that she was in trouble, that her car had broken down somewhere behind me, and she was walking to find help, that she was lost or confused or maybe fleeing something that had put her on this road, in conditions no sane person would choose. My second thought was that she was going to die out there if someone didn't help her, that the temperature was dropping and the rain wasn't letting up and hypothermia could kill a person in a summer dress within hours. I pulled over maybe 50 feet ahead of her, put on my hazard lights, and watched in my side mirror as she continued walking toward my truck. The rain was coming down so hard it looked like static on an old television, a curtain of water that should have made it difficult to see anything clearly at that distance, but I could see her perfectly, could see the white of her dress, the darkness of her hair, the way she walked with steps that seemed too smooth, too steady, too undisturbed by the weather, that should have been battering her the way it was battering everything else. She reached my passenger side and walked past without looking up. I waited for her to stop, to knock on my window, to acknowledge in any way that I'd pulled over to help her. But she just kept walking, her pace unchanged, her attention fixed on something ahead that I couldn't see. I rolled down my window, felt rain immediately soak the arm I extended into the storm, and called out to her. "Ma'am, do you need help? Ma'am?" She didn't respond, didn't turn, Didn't pause, didn't give any indication that she'd heard me at all. She just kept walking, already past my cab now, moving toward the darkness ahead with the same steady pace she'd maintained since I first saw her. That's when I noticed the rain. I'd been so focused on her, so caught up in the strangeness of finding a woman walking a mountain highway in a storm, that I hadn't really looked at what the rain was doing when it reached her. Now, watching her move away from my truck, I could see it clearly in my headlights and the glow of my hazard lights. The rain was passing through her, not bouncing off her dress the way it bounced off the road and the guardrails in my truck, not soaking the fabric and plastering it to her body the way rain soaks everything it touches. The drops were falling through her shoulders and her back and her hair, hitting the pavement beneath her as if she wasn't there, as if her body was made of something the rain couldn't touch. I sat frozen in my cab, window still open, rain still soaking my arm, watching something that couldn't be happening continue to happen 20 feet from my truck. She walked another 10 feet, then another, her form growing dimmer as she moved away from my lights, but never quite disappearing, never quite becoming invisible, despite the darkness and the rain and the distance that was growing between us. Then she stepped off the shoulder, not onto another road, not into a car that had been waiting for her, but off the shoulder and into the woods that bordered a cliff. I knew from years of driving this route, a drop of at least 200 feet into a gorge that had claimed more than a few vehicles over the decades. She stepped off the pavement and into trees that shouldn't have been passable, into darkness that swallowed her like water closing over a stone, and then she was gone. I sat there for 10 minutes, engine idling, hazards blinking, rain pounding on my roof like fists demanding entry. I told myself I'd imagined it, that exhaustion and darkness and the hypnotic effect of rain had combined to create a hallucination, that there had been no woman, no summer dress, no figure walking through a storm without getting wet. I told myself all the things you tell yourself when you've seen something that breaks the rules of the world you thought you understood. Then I got out with my flashlight. The rain hit me like a physical force, cold and heavy and relentless, soaking through my jacket in seconds, and making the beam of my flashlight seem pathetic against the darkness it was trying to penetrate. I walked along the shoulder to the spot where I'd seen her step off the road, half expecting to find nothing, half hoping to find something that would explain what I'd witnessed. The cross was weathered, its wood gone gray with years of exposure to mountain weather, but someone had been there recently. Fresh flowers lay at its base, protected from the worst of the rain by plastic wrap that had been carefully arranged to keep them from drowning. A name had been carved into the crossbeam, letters that had been cut deep enough to survive decades of erosion. Margaret Collins. I stood there in the rain, reading a name I didn't know, looking at a memorial I'd never noticed in all the years I'd driven this route, trying to connect what I was seeing to what I'd just witnessed. The woods behind the cross were impassable, a tangle of undergrowth and trees that grew right up to the edge of a cliff that dropped into darkness my flashlight couldn't reach. No one could have walked through there. No one could have taken 3 steps into that vegetation without stopping, without falling, without leaving some sign of their passage. But she had walked through, had stepped off the road and into trees and disappeared as if the physical world had stopped applying to her somewhere between the pavement and the forest. I looked her up when I got to the distribution center the next morning, used my phone to search for Margaret Collins and Route 19 and any combination of words that might explain the cross and the flowers and the woman I'd seen walking through rain that couldn't touch her. The article was from 1987, archived in a local newspaper's digital database, a brief story about a hit and run that had killed a young woman walking home from her night shift at a diner 6 miles down the highway. Margaret Collins, 23 years old, struck from behind by a vehicle that never stopped, her body found the next morning by a trucker who'd noticed something in his headlights that shouldn't have been there. The driver was never found. The article mentioned that police believed it was a truck based on the injuries, based on the height of the impact, based on evidence at the scene that suggested something much larger than a car had hit her and kept going without slowing down. They'd interviewed truckers who regularly drove that route, had checked logs and manifests and all the records that might identify who had been on that road at 2 a.m. on an October night in 1987. They'd never found him. I've driven Route 19 maybe 40 times since that night. I've looked for the cross every single trip, slowing down on that stretch of highway, watching the shoulder for weathered wood and plastic-wrapped flowers, and a name that's been carved into my memory, the way it was carved into that crossbeam. I've never seen it again. The spot where I found it looks the same as every other spot on that section of road. Trees and guardrails and shoulder that shows no sign of a memorial that stood there for at least 30 years before I found it. I've stopped, gotten out, walked the stretch of highway where I know the cross should be. There's nothing there. Just pavement and forest and a cliff that drops into darkness that seems deeper than it should be. But I still see her sometimes. On rainy nights, on that stretch of Route 19, I'll catch a glimpse of something in my headlights. A white dress, a figure walking with steps that seem too smooth for the weather they're moving through. I don't stop anymore. Don't slow down. Don't pull over. Don't try to help a woman who's been dead for 32 years and is still walking home from a shift that ended in 1987. I just watch her pass through my lights and disappear into darkness, and I wonder if she knows what happened to her. If she remembers the impact, the driver who didn't stop, the decades she spent walking a highway that has no end she can reach. I wonder if she sees my truck the way she saw his, if every passing vehicle is a reminder of the one that killed her, if she's looking for him or running from him or simply trapped in a moment that never finished playing out. I think about the driver sometimes, the trucker who hit her and kept going, who drove away from something he did and never faced any consequences for taking a 23-year-old woman's life. I wonder if he's still alive, if he still drives these roads, if he's ever seen her walking along the shoulder of the highway he made into her grave. I wonder if she's looking for him. And I wonder, on the darkest nights, when the rain is heavy and the mountains feel like they're closing in, and my headlights seem weaker than they should be against darkness that has weight and presence and intention, whether she knows the difference anymore. Whether every truck that passes is the truck that killed her. Whether she walks that highway waiting for something that will never come or hunting something that got away. I've been driving trucks through Appalachia for 23 years. I've seen things I can't explain to anyone who hasn't spent nights alone in a cab watching darkness swallow their headlights. Margaret Collins is the thing I think about most. Not because she scared me, not because she threatened me, but because she was 23 years old when a trucker fell asleep and ended her life without even knowing it. And now she walks a highway in the rain, forever trying to get home from a shift that should have ended with morning coffee and a warm bed, forever passing through storms that can't touch her anymore, forever stepping off a road that never leads anywhere except back to the beginning. I hope she finds peace someday. I hope whatever keeps her on that highway finally lets her go, finally allows her to reach a destination that isn't darkness and cliff, and a memorial that appears and disappears like the woman it was built to remember. But I don't think hope matters much to someone who's been walking the same road for 32 years. I think Margaret Collins will keep walking, keep passing through rain that can't touch her, keep stepping into woods that shouldn't be passable, and emerging somewhere I can't follow. And I think whoever hit her, if he's still alive, if he's still driving these mountains, will see her someday too. I hope he's ready. I hope he understands what's waiting for him on the shoulder of Route 19, in a summer dress that has no business being worn in October, looking for the truck that killed her all those years ago. I hope he knows she hasn't forgotten. I'd been driving the same route through West Virginia for 15 years when I found the truck stop that shouldn't have existed. That's what I tell people when they ask. Though most people don't ask because I've learned not to bring it up, learned that some experiences sound like lies no matter how true they are, learned that the world prefers explanations that fit into the boxes we've built for it rather than the ones that tear those boxes apart. The route was Interstate 77 through the southern part of the state, a stretch of highway that cuts through mountains so old they've worn themselves down to something almost gentle, hills rather than peaks, forests that roll toward horizons that seem to go on forever. I'd been driving it since 2004, twice a week minimum, hauling everything from auto parts to appliances to furniture that people ordered online and expected to appear at their doors without thinking about the trucks and drivers that made such appearances possible. I knew every exit, every rest stop, every stretch where the cell service died and the radio stations faded into static. I knew where the deer liked to cross and which grades required downshifting, and where the highway patrol liked to hide with their radar guns pointed at truckers who thought they could make up time on empty roads. The night I'm talking about was in March 2019, a Wednesday that had started badly and gotten worse with every mile. My dispatcher had called at 4 a.m. with a load that needed to be picked up in Pennsylvania and delivered to Charlotte by the next morning, a schedule that was technically possible, but only if nothing went wrong If traffic cooperated, if weather stayed clear, if all the thousand things that can delay a truck decided to give me a pass for once, none of them did. The pickup was late because the warehouse was understaffed. Traffic outside Pittsburgh added 2 hours to a drive that should have taken 4. And the weather, which had been clear when I'd started, had deteriorated into a rainstorm that seemed personal, that seemed to follow my truck down highways that would have been challenging even in perfect conditions. By the time I crossed into West Virginia, I was exhausted and frustrated, and watching my fuel gauge drop toward empty with the kind of fatalism that sets in when you've been fighting a losing battle for too many hours. The rain was coming down hard enough to turn my windshield into a waterfall that my wipers couldn't control. I'd been looking for somewhere to stop for the last 30 miles, a truck stop or rest area, or even a wide shoulder where I could wait out the worst of it, catch a few hours of sleep, face the remainder of the drive with something less than the bone-deep tiredness that was making my reaction slow and my judgment questionable. But there was nothing, just highway and trees and darkness that my headlights barely dented. A stretch of Interstate 77 I'd driven hundreds of times and knew held nothing but forest for the next 40 miles. I was considering pulling onto the shoulder anyway, risking a ticket or worse just to close my eyes for a few minutes, when I saw the lights. They appeared through the rain like something from a dream. Neon signs glowing pink and blue, and the yellow of a diner that was open all night, the kind of light that truckers learn to recognize from miles away, because it means food and fuel and a few minutes of human contact in a job that offers none of those things reliably. A truck stop, complete with a parking lot full of rigs and a fuel island, with lights that reflected off wet pavement like stars scattered across the ground. I pulled in without thinking, the relief of finding exactly what I needed, overwhelming any question of how it had gotten there, of why I'd never noticed it in 15 years of driving this route, of why the trucks in the parking lot looked older than anything still licensed for highway use. The fuel pumps were the old kind, the kind I remembered from my father's gas station before everything went digital, but they worked well enough, accepted the fleet card my company had given me, and filled my tank with diesel that smelled the way diesel has always smelled. The diner was attached to a small convenience store, the kind of setup that had been common in the 70s and 80s, before truck stops became corporate franchises, with standardized layouts and menu items that tasted the same in West Virginia as they did in California. I pushed through a glass door that had a bell mounted above it, the kind that jangled to announce arrivals, and stepped into warmth that felt like a physical embrace after hours in a cab that never quite got as warm as I wanted it to. The place was full. Not packed, but occupied in a way that suggested regulars rather than travelers. People who knew this diner and came here often, who had their usual seats and their usual orders, and their usual conversations with waitresses who knew their names. They looked up when I walked in, all of them, a dozen pairs of eyes turning toward the door with an attention that felt expectant rather than curious, as if they'd been waiting for someone to arrive and were checking to see if I was the person they'd been expecting. I found a seat at the counter because the booths all seemed occupied, settled onto a stool that had been worn smooth by decades of use, and waited for someone to notice me. The waitress appeared almost immediately, a woman in her 50s with hair that had been styled in a way I associated with my mother's generation, a look that had been fashionable 40 years ago and had apparently never been updated since. She poured coffee without asking, set the cup in front of me with the practiced motion of someone who'd done this thousands of times, and smiled with warmth that felt genuine despite coming from a stranger. "Your usual tonight, David?" I looked at her, confused by the familiarity in her voice, by the name that wasn't mine, by the assumption that I had a usual in a place I'd never been before. "I think you've got me confused with someone else," I said. "My name's not David, and I've never been here before." Her smile didn't falter, didn't change, didn't acknowledge what I'd said as anything other than a response she'd heard before and knew how to handle. "Everyone says that the first time," she said. "Your usual will be right out." I should have questioned it more, should have insisted on seeing a menu, should have asked where exactly this truck stop was located, should have paid attention to the wrongness that was accumulating around me, like the rain collecting in puddles outside. But I was tired, so tired that even confusion felt like too much effort, and the coffee was good, better than anything I'd tasted from a truck stop in years, and the warmth of the diner was making my eyes heavy in a way that felt like permission to stop fighting. The food arrived without me ordering it. A plate of eggs and bacon and hash browns, toast with butter that had been applied in a perfect layer, a glass of orange juice that appeared beside my coffee, as if the waitress had known I'd want it before I'd known myself. The truckers around me were eating their own meals, having their own conversations, occasionally glancing in my direction with expressions I couldn't quite read, something between welcome and recognition, as if they knew me even though I knew for certain I'd never seen any of them before. I ate without tasting much, the food satisfying a hunger I hadn't realized I'd been carrying, my body grateful for fuel, even if my mind was struggling to process the environment in which that fuel was being provided. The conversations around me drifted in and out of my awareness, fragments of dialogue that seemed normal enough when I focused on them, but felt wrong when I tried to piece them together into a coherent picture. "Been driving this route for 30 years, one man was saying. "Never gets old." "Same here," another responded. "Feels like home. Feels like the only home I've ever known." The new ones never understand at first, but they learn. They all learn eventually. I finished my meal, paid with cash because the waitress said they didn't take cards, a detail that should have struck me as strange in 2019 but somehow didn't register as anything more than a quirk. The total was less than half what I'd have paid at any other truck stop, prices that belonged to a decade I barely remembered, a time when coffee cost 50 cents and a full meal could be had for under $5. The rain had slowed by the time I stepped outside, the storm that had been hammering the mountains all night finally exhausting itself, leaving behind a darkness that was quieter than it had been, more peaceful, almost inviting. My truck was where I'd left it, tank full, cab dry, everything exactly as it should have been except for a feeling I couldn't shake, a sense that I'd crossed some threshold I hadn't been aware of and wasn't sure how to cross back. I drove away as dawn started breaking over the mountains, pink light touching the tops of trees that had been invisible just hours before, revealing a landscape I'd seen hundreds of times, and that looked exactly the way it had always looked. The highway stretched ahead of me, familiar and unremarkable, the same stretch of Interstate 77 I'd been driving for 15 years. I glanced in my rearview mirror, wanting one last look at the truck stop that had provided exactly what I'd needed, exactly when I'd needed it. There was nothing there, just trees, highway, the empty stretch of road where I knew, with absolute certainty, nothing had been built since the 1,940 seconds, when the interstate was just a plan on paper, and the mountains held nothing but forest and the occasional dirt road carved by people who had vanished long before I'd been born. I pulled over, got out of my truck, walked back along the shoulder to the spot where I'd turned off the highway, where I'd fueled up and eaten a meal, and talked to a waitress who had called me by a name that wasn't mine. There was no exit, no access road, no indication that any vehicle had ever left the highway at this point. Just guardrail and trees and a hillside that dropped away into a valley that showed no sign of human habitation. No lights, no buildings, nothing but the West Virginia wilderness that had been there since before anyone thought to drive trucks through it. I've driven that route 100 times since that night, more than 100. I've watched for the lights every single trip, slowed down on that stretch of highway, looked for signs of a truck stop that I ate in and paid for, and can still taste when I think about it hard enough. It has never come back. I've asked other truckers about it, the ones who've been driving these mountains long enough that they might remember something from decades ago. Most of them don't know what I'm talking about. A few get quiet when I describe it, get a look in their eyes that suggests they know exactly what I'm talking about but don't want to admit it. One old-timer, a man who'd been driving since the 70s, told me about a truck stop that had existed on that stretch of highway in 1973. Family-owned, popular with drivers who worked the Appalachian routes, a place where the coffee was always good and the waitresses knew everyone's name. It had burned down in 1974, he said. Fire that started in the kitchen and spread too fast for anyone to stop. 7 people had died, including the owners and 3 truckers who'd been eating dinner when the flames reached the dining room. They'd never rebuilt. The property had been sold, the ruins cleared, the forest allowed to reclaim what had briefly been carved out of it. By 1980, he said, you couldn't tell anything had ever been there. I think about that sometimes. About a truck stop that burned down 45 years before I found it. About a waitress who called me David. About truckers who talked about driving routes for 30 years in a diner that had only existed for a decade before fire took it and everyone inside. I think about the name she called me, David, a name that wasn't mine but felt familiar somehow. Felt like something I should recognize. Felt like someone I might have been in a different life, or a different time, or a different version of a story that had been playing out on these mountains since before the interstate existed. I looked it up later. The records from the fire, the names of the truckers who died in a diner that had been their second home, a place where the coffee was always good and the waitresses knew what you wanted before you knew yourself. One of them was named David. David Marsh, 43 years old, died in the fire of 1974 while eating his usual dinner at a counter where he'd sat every Wednesday night for 6 years. I was 43 in March 2019. I'd been driving that route every Wednesday for as long as I could remember. And sometimes, when the rain is heavy and the miles are long and I'm looking for somewhere to stop on a stretch of highway where nothing should exist, I wonder if I'm still driving. Wonder if the truck stop is still there, waiting for me to pull in again, waiting for the waitress to pour coffee and tell me my usual will be right out. Wonder if I ever left. Wonder if I'm the one who burned. The rain started around midnight somewhere north of Beckley, the kind of mountain storm that turns highways into rivers and visibility into a memory of something you used to have and might never get back. I'd been watching the weather all evening, tracking forecasts on my phone during fuel stops, hoping the system would pass before I reached the section of Interstate 64 that cuts through the most unforgiving terrain West Virginia has to offer. The forecasts were wrong, the way forecasts in mountain country are always wrong, and by the time I realized how bad it was going to get, I was already too deep into the route to turn back. I've been driving trucks for 19 years, and I've learned that the mountains have their own weather, their own rules, their own ways of testing you that flatland drivers never have to face. Storms that appear out of nowhere, fog that rises from valleys and swallows highways whole, ice that forms on bridges when the temperature drops 10 degrees in 10 minutes. You learn to respect it, or you learn to fear it, or you don't survive long enough to learn anything at all. The storm that hit that night was the kind that makes experienced drivers pull over and wait, that turns 18-wheelers into liabilities, and reduces visibility to whatever your headlights can illuminate before the rain swallows everything beyond. I should have stopped, should have found a truck stop or rest area, and waited it out the way common sense demanded. But I was running behind schedule, had a delivery window that was already going to be tight, and I made the calculation that truckers make 1,000 times a year, the risk of driving through versus the cost of being late. I was 10 miles into the worst of it when I noticed the headlights. They appeared in my mirrors without fanfare, 2 points of white light behind me that seemed brighter than they should have been given the weather, more defined than the rain should have allowed. I thought at first it was another trucker, someone doing what I was doing, pushing through conditions that should have stopped us both because the loads we were hauling and the schedules we were keeping didn't care about weather or safety or the limits of what human attention could maintain. Following another truck's taillights through a storm is standard practice. You find someone going your direction, you match their pace, you let their lights guide you when the road ahead becomes nothing but rain and guesswork. It's safer than driving alone, gives you something to focus on besides the endless gray that swallows everything beyond your wiper's reach. I'd done it hundreds of times, had been the lead truck and the following truck in conditions much worse than this. But something about these headlights felt different. The distance they maintained was too perfect. Not the slight variations you'd expect from another driver making constant adjustments, speeding up slightly on straightaways, slowing down slightly on curves, the natural rhythm of human attention, responding to changing conditions. These lights stayed exactly the same distance behind me no matter what I did. When I slowed to 40 on a curve that required caution, they slowed to match. When I sped up to 60 on a straightaway that offered better visibility, they accelerated at precisely the same rate, maintaining a gap that never widened or narrowed by so much as a foot. I tested it, deliberately varied my speed in ways that had no relationship to the road conditions, slowing down when I should have maintained speed, accelerating when I should have been cautious. The headlights matched every change instantly, as if they weren't reacting to my movements but anticipating them, as if they knew what I was going to do before I did it and adjusted accordingly. I told myself it was coincidence, told myself I was tired and the rain was playing tricks, and there was nothing unusual about another vehicle maintaining consistent distance behind a truck they were using as a guide through dangerous weather. I told myself all the things you tell yourself when something feels wrong but you can't identify exactly what that wrongness is or where it's coming from. The rest stop appeared through the rain about 30 miles in, a small pull-off with parking for maybe a dozen cars and a bathroom building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1,970 seconds. I pulled in on impulse, telling myself I needed to check my load, needed to stretch my legs, needed a few minutes of stillness after an hour of fighting weather that wanted me dead. The headlights followed. They pulled into the rest stop behind me, maintaining that same perfect distance, and parked at the far end of the lot where the darkness was thickest and the lights from the bathroom building couldn't reach. They didn't turn off, just sat there, idling, their beams pointing at my truck like eyes that refused to look away. I sat in my cab for 20 minutes, watching those lights in my mirrors, waiting for something to happen. For a door to open, for a figure to emerge, for any indication of who was driving the vehicle that had been following me for 30 miles through a storm that should have separated us a dozen times over. The rain continued to fall, drumming on my roof and streaming down my windows, and the headlights continued to burn, and nothing moved in the darkness between us. I thought about getting out, thought about walking across that parking lot and knocking on the window of whatever vehicle was sitting there, demanding to know who they were and why they were following me and what they wanted from a trucker who was just trying to make his delivery and go home. But something stopped me. Some instinct that had been honed by 19 years of driving through country that didn't always follow the rules I thought I understood. The headlights didn't feel like they belonged to someone who would answer questions. They felt like they belonged to something that was waiting, that had been waiting, that would continue to wait for as long as it took for me to make a decision that I didn't yet know I was being asked to make. I pulled back onto the highway without getting out of my cab. The headlights followed. Same distance, same unwavering pace, same presence that felt less like coincidence with every mile and more like intention, like purpose, like something that had chosen me for reasons I couldn't understand and wasn't going to let me go until whatever it wanted had been accomplished. I tried the CB radio, hoping to reach another trucker who might be able to see what was behind me, who might be able to describe the vehicle that had been following me for 40 miles now and showed no sign of stopping. The radio crackled with static, the storm interfering with signals that should have reached at least a few miles, and no one responded to my calls. I was alone on that highway, alone except for headlights that matched my every movement and a storm that seemed to be conspiring to keep anyone else from witnessing what was happening. The fear set in around mile 50. Not the sharp fear of immediate danger, the kind that triggers adrenaline and fight or flight, and all the responses evolution has given us to survive threats we can identify. This was something different, something slower, something that crept into my chest and settled there like a weight that made breathing harder, that made thinking clearly feel like swimming through mud. The fear of something wrong that you can't name, can't fight, can't escape because you don't know what you're escaping from. I started watching the headlights more than I watched the road. Couldn't help it, couldn't stop myself from glancing in my mirrors every few seconds, confirming that they were still there, still following, still maintaining that impossible perfect distance. My attention was splitting, dividing between the rain-slicked highway ahead and the lights that had become the most important thing in my world, and I knew that split attention was dangerous, knew that the mountains killed drivers who couldn't focus, but I couldn't stop watching. The exit appeared around mile 60, a sign that announced a small town I'd never heard of, population under 1,000, the kind of place that existed because someone had built something there once, and people had kept living in it out of habit rather than necessity. The sign also mentioned a sheriff's station, 3 miles from the highway, and I made my decision without conscious thought, steering toward the exit with a desperation that felt like survival. The headlights didn't follow. I watched them in my mirror as I took the exit ramp, watched them continue straight on the highway, watched them disappear into rain that swallowed them completely, and I felt something release in my chest, something that had been clenched so tight I hadn't realized I wasn't breathing properly until I started breathing again. The sheriff's station was exactly where the sign said it would be, a small building with a parking lot that could hold maybe 6 cars and a deputy's cruiser parked near the entrance. I pulled my truck into the lot, taking up more space than I should have, and went inside with a story I wasn't sure how to tell. The deputy who listened was older than me, gray at the temples and tired around the eyes, the kind of man who had seen enough in his career that nothing surprised him anymore. He let me describe what had happened, without interrupting, without the skepticism I'd expected, without any of the dismissive responses I'd prepared myself to receive. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out a notebook, flipped through pages that were filled with handwriting I couldn't read from where I sat, and looked at me with an expression that was hard to interpret. "You're the third one this month," he said. "Third trucker to come in here talking about headlights that followed them through the mountains. Same story every time. Perfect distance, won't pass, won't stop, just follows until someone pulls off, and then continues on like nothing happened." "What is it?" I asked. "What's following us?" He shook his head slowly, the gesture of someone who'd been asking the same question and hadn't found an answer he could accept. "Nobody knows. The truckers who report it never see what's driving. The headlights are always behind them, always at that same distance, always disappearing when they exit the highway. We've tried to intercept it, tried to position a cruiser on the highway, and catch whatever vehicle is doing this. Never found anything. Just empty highway and rain and darkness that doesn't give up its secrets. Has anyone ever not pulled off? Just kept driving to see what would happen?" The deputy's expression changed, shifted into something that might have been fear or might have been warning. "One guy, about 6 years ago, trucker who'd been driving these mountains for 30 years, didn't believe in anything he couldn't explain, decided he was going to find out what was following him, even if it meant driving until his fuel ran out." "What happened?" "They found his truck 3 days later, parked on the shoulder about 200 miles past where anyone would have expected him to stop. Engine cold, cab empty, no sign of him. No sign of struggle or accident or anything that would explain why he'd stopped there or where he'd gone after." "They never found him?" "Never found him. Never found any evidence of what happened to him. Just an empty truck on the side of a highway and a manifest that said he should have been in Tennessee 2 days earlier." I sat with that for a long time, thinking about headlights that maintained perfect distance, about a trucker who'd decided to find out what was following him and had become a mystery himself, about the question of what might have happened if I'd kept driving instead of taking that exit. The deputy let me stay until the storm passed, let me sleep in my cab in his parking lot until dawn broke over mountains that looked peaceful in morning light, that gave no indication of what they'd held the night before. I drove the rest of my route in daylight, watching my mirrors more than I'd ever watched them, jumping at every set of headlights that appeared behind me, even though the sun was bright and the roads were dry. I've driven that stretch of Interstate 64 maybe 50 times since that night. Never at night if I can help it. Never in rain if I have any choice. And every time I pass the exit that leads to that small town with the sheriff's station, I think about the headlights that followed me for 60 miles and then let me go, that chose to continue on instead of following me into a town with a deputy who was keeping records of everyone they'd done this to. I think about the trucker who decided not to exit, who kept driving until he became a missing person instead of a witness. I think about what might have happened if I'd made the same choice. And I think about the headlights, still out there somewhere, still following trucks through storms on mountain highways, still maintaining that perfect distance that feels less like coincidence and more like intention, still waiting for someone who won't pull off, still waiting to show them what happens when you keep driving. I've never hit anything larger than a raccoon in 31 years of driving, and I've always been proud of that record. It's the kind of thing you hold on to when your job is spending nights alone in a cab watching the world pass by in headlights and mile markers, the kind of accomplishment that means something, even if no one gives you a certificate or a bonus check for achieving it. 31 years, millions of miles, and the worst I'd ever done was a raccoon that darted out of the darkness too fast for brakes to matter. I'd seen plenty of close calls, deer that froze in my lights and bolted at the last second, dogs that chased shadows across highways and somehow made it to the other side, people who wandered too close to traffic and didn't realize how close they'd come to becoming statistics. But I'd never hit anything that would haunt me. The night I almost broke that record changed something in me that hasn't changed back. It was October 2021, a Thursday that had started with a pickup in Kentucky and was supposed to end with a delivery in Georgia. The route took me through eastern Tennessee, a stretch of highway that winds through mountains so steep and curves so tight that even experienced truckers have to pay attention every second. I'd driven it dozens of times over the years, knew its quirks and dangers, respected the grades that could burn out brakes and the curves that could flip a trailer if you took them too fast. The rain started around 9 p.m., just as I was entering the most challenging section of the route. Not a gentle rain that you can drive through without much thought, but a mountain storm that seemed to have personal intentions, water falling so hard and fast that my wipers were useless and my headlights became nothing but glare, reflected back at me from a wall of wet that refused to let me see through it. I should have pulled over, should have found somewhere safe to wait out the weather, should have prioritized survival over schedule the way 31 years of experience had taught me. But I was making good time, was running ahead of my delivery window for once, and I made the calculation that the storm would pass before the road got truly dangerous. The calculation was wrong. The grade I'm talking about is a 6-mile descent, a drop of almost 2,000 feet that requires careful management of speed and brakes, and the constant awareness that gravity is not your friend when you're piloting 40 tons of truck and cargo down a slope that wants to turn you into a runaway. In good weather, it's challenging. In rain like this, it was something else entirely. The road transformed into a mirror that reflected my headlights back at me, that turned the pavement into something I couldn't quite see and couldn't quite trust. I was 3 miles into the descent, managing my speed with engine braking and careful application of the pedal, when I saw the child. He was standing in the middle of my lane, maybe 100 feet ahead, visible in the brief moments when rain parted enough to let my headlights reach that far. A boy, small, maybe 7 years old, wearing pajamas that were soaked through and plastered to his body. He wasn't moving, wasn't running, wasn't doing any of the things a child should do when an 18-wheeler is bearing down on them through rain that should have made standing outside impossible. He was just standing there, looking directly at my truck with eyes that caught the light and held it, eyes that seemed brighter than they should have been, more defined than anything else in a night that had dissolved into water and darkness, and the desperate hope that I could stop in time. I hit the brakes. In 31 years of driving, I've had to make emergency stops maybe a dozen times. It's a controlled maneuver when you do it right, a careful balance of braking force and steering adjustment that brings you to a halt without losing control, without jackknifing the trailer, without turning a bad situation into a catastrophe. I knew how to do it, had practiced it, had taught younger drivers how to manage it, had confidence in my ability to stop a truck in conditions that would have panicked someone with less experience. But this wasn't a controlled stop. This was panic, pure and simple, the reflex of a man who saw a child about to die under his wheels and reacted with every ounce of force his body could produce. I stood on that brake pedal like I was trying to push it through the floor, felt the tires lock and break free, and lock again as the anti-lock system fought to maintain some semblance of control, felt the trailer behind me start to swing as momentum and gravity and wet pavement conspired to remind me that physics doesn't care about intentions. The rig jackknifed. Trailer swinging out to my left, cab rotating toward the right, the whole assembly sliding across pavement that might as well have been ice for all the traction it offered. I saw the guardrail coming, the thin strip of metal that was the only thing between me and a drop that would have ended everything. And I thought with perfect clarity that this was how it would finish. 31 years of driving ending on a mountain grade in Tennessee, because a child was standing in the road and I'd done exactly what any decent human being would do. The truck stopped 6 feet from where the boy had been standing, 6 feet from the guardrail, 6 feet from a drop I couldn't see through the rain but knew was there, a ravine that had claimed trucks before and would claim trucks again, that was waiting for me to make one more mistake. I sat in my cab, hands shaking, breath coming in gasps that fogged the windshield I'd been staring through. The engine was still running, the headlights still burning, the wipers still fighting a losing battle against rain that didn't care about anything I'd just survived. I looked at the road ahead, at the spot where the boy had been standing, at the pavement that was empty now, that held nothing but water and reflected light, and the absence of a child who should have been there. He was gone. Not on the shoulder, not running away, not anywhere in the field of illumination my headlights created. Just gone, as if he'd never been there, as if I'd imagined a child standing in the rain at 10 p.m. on a mountain grade that no child should have been anywhere near. I got out of my truck, stood in rain that soaked me in seconds, that ran down my face and blurred my vision, and didn't care that I was looking for a boy who might have been hit, might have been thrown to the side, might have been lying in the darkness beyond my lights with injuries that would kill him if I didn't find him in time. I had a flashlight in my cab, grabbed it, swept the beam across pavement and shoulder, and the trees that lined the road. Nothing. No child. No body. No footprints in the mud that had formed along the shoulder. No disturbance in the vegetation that would suggest someone had fled into the forest. No evidence that anything living had been standing on that road seconds before my truck had come screaming through the rain toward it. I called 911, described what I'd seen, what I'd done, what I couldn't find. The dispatcher's voice was calm in a way that suggested she'd heard this before, that suggested calls from truckers about children in the road weren't as unusual as I wanted them to be. She told me to stay put, that officers would be there soon, that I should wait in my truck with my hazard lights on so they could find me. I waited for 2 hours. 2 hours of sitting in my cab while police searched woods that held nothing but rain and darkness. 2 hours of answering questions about what I'd seen, what the child had looked like, how long he'd been standing there before I noticed him. 2 hours of watching flashlight beams sweep through trees that refused to give up whatever secrets they were holding. The officer who finally let me go was in his 50s, a man with a face that had seen enough of these mountains to know things he probably wished he didn't. He stood at my window, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're not the first," he said. "Truckers report seeing that boy 3 or 4 times a year. Always on this stretch of grade, always in weather like this, rain or fog or something that makes stopping hard. What is it? Who is he?" The officer shook his head slowly. "We don't know. We've searched these woods 100 times after calls like yours. Never found a child. Never found any evidence that a child was ever here. But I saw him. He was standing right there, looking at my truck. I could see his face. I believe you. I believe everyone who reports it. But believing isn't the same as understanding. Has anyone ever hit him?" The officer was quiet for a long moment. Rain continued to fall, continued to run down my windshield in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. "There was an accident here in 1987, he finally said. "A trucker coming down this grade in a storm, just like tonight. He reported seeing a child in the road, tried to stop, lost control, went over the guardrail into the ravine. Did they find him? They found the truck, found the driver too, eventually. He didn't survive the fall. And the child? There was a search. 2 days, dogs and helicopters, and everything the department could mobilize. They found nothing. No child on the road, no child in the woods, no missing person report that matched what the driver had described in his last radio transmission." I sat with that for a moment, processing the implications. So the boy I saw, maybe the same one the driver in 87 saw, maybe something else. These mountains hold on to things, memories and echoes and whatever you want to call the stuff that doesn't fit into the world we think we understand. I've been patrolling this stretch for 22 years, and I stopped trying to explain it a long time ago. What do you tell people when they call like I did? I tell them what I'm telling you, that they saw something we can't explain, that the boy appears to truckers on this grade, always in bad weather, always in conditions that make stopping nearly impossible, that no one's ever found him, and no one's ever hit him, and he keeps showing up despite our best efforts to understand why. No one's ever hit him? The officer met my eyes with a steadiness that felt significant. No one's ever hit him and stopped. The driver in 87 didn't stop because he couldn't. The ones who see him and manage to brake in time, they always find the same thing you found tonight. Empty road, no child, nothing but questions that don't have answers. I drove away from that mountain grade as dawn started breaking over ridges that looked peaceful in morning light. I finished my delivery, filed my reports, told my company that weather had delayed me without specifying what kind of weather or what had really happened on that stretch of highway in Tennessee. But I haven't driven that route since. Haven't been able to make myself take the assignment when it comes up. Haven't been able to face the possibility of coming down that grade in rain and seeing a child standing in my lane, waiting for me to stop or fail to stop, waiting for whatever comes next. I think about him sometimes, about a boy in soaked pajamas, standing on a road where no child should be, looking at trucks with eyes that catch the light and hold it. I think about the driver in 1987 who saw the same thing and couldn't stop in time, who went over a guardrail and into a ravine and never came home. I think about what he saw in those last seconds, whether the boy was still there as the truck went over the edge, whether those bright eyes followed him down into darkness that ended everything. And I wonder, on nights when I can't sleep, whether the boy is a warning or a test, whether he appears to truckers who can stop and truckers who can't, sorting them into categories that determine who survives and who joins the driver from 1,987 at the bottom of a ravine that keeps its secrets. I wonder if he'll still be standing there when the next trucker comes down that grade in weather that makes stopping almost impossible. I wonder if the next one will be as lucky as I was. And I hope, with whatever part of me still believes in hope, that whoever sees him next has brakes that work and reflexes that are fast enough, and a truck that responds the way trucks are supposed to respond when you need them to stop. Because I've never hit anything larger than a raccoon in 31 years of driving, and I don't want to learn what happens when someone finally hits that boy. CB radio has saved my life more times than I can count. Other truckers warning about accidents and weather and road conditions that GPS doesn't know about. There's a community on those channels that people who don't drive trucks will never understand. A network of strangers watching out for strangers, sharing information that can mean the difference between making it home and becoming a statistic on a highway that doesn't care who you are or how many years you've been doing this. I've heard a lot of things on CB over 26 years of driving. Warnings about black ice that hadn't shown up on any weather report. Tips about speed traps in counties where the sheriff used ticket revenue to fund his department. Gossip and jokes, and the kind of conversation that keeps you awake when the miles stretch on and the darkness seems endless. I've heard truckers in trouble calling for help, heard the relief in voices when help arrived, heard the silence that comes when help doesn't arrive in time. But I'd never heard anything like the voice I heard during a rainstorm in Virginia in September 2020. The night had started normally enough. A long haul from a distribution center in Pennsylvania to a warehouse in North Carolina, the kind of routine run I'd done so many times. I could probably manage it in my sleep. The weather had been clear when I'd started, had deteriorated gradually as I moved south, and had turned into a genuine mountain storm by the time I crossed into Virginia, rain coming down hard enough to reduce visibility to whatever my headlights could illuminate through water that seemed determined to drown everything. I was monitoring Channel 19 the way I always did, listening to other truckers share information about conditions ahead, warnings about standing water and reduced visibility, and the particular hazards that mountain highways present during storms. The chatter was normal, the voices familiar in the way that CB voices become familiar even when you've never met the people behind them. A rhythm of communication that felt like safety in a night that felt like danger. The voice broke through around 1 a.m. It wasn't like the other voices on the channel. It came through static that seemed worse than the storm should have caused. A crackling interference that made the words hard to catch at first, that required focus to separate signal from noise. A woman's voice, soft and urgent, speaking with an intensity that made me reach for my radio before I even understood what she was saying. Then she said my name. Not my handle, not the nickname I used on CB that identified me to other truckers. My actual name, Michael. The name on my license, the name my mother gave me. The name I hadn't told anyone in the trucking community because there's no reason to share personal details with people you'll never meet in person. Michael, don't look in your sleeper. I almost crashed, almost swerved into the guardrail that separated my lane from a drop I couldn't see, but knew was there. The reflex of hearing my name from a voice I didn't recognize on a channel that shouldn't have known who I was. My hands tightened on the wheel, my foot eased off the accelerator, and I listened with an attention I'd never given to any radio transmission in 26 years of driving. Something got in while you were fueling up, 200 miles back. The truck stop outside of Harrisburg. You left your cab unlocked while you went inside to pay. I had. I'd stopped at a truck stop outside Harrisburg around 10 p.m., had gone inside to use the bathroom and grab coffee and pay for the diesel I'd pumped. Had left my cab unlocked because I was only going to be 5 minutes, and the lot was well lit, and I'd done the same thing 1,000 times before without incident. Don't look in your sleeper, Michael. Don't turn around. Don't acknowledge that you know. Just keep driving until sunrise. Don't stop for anything. The voice crackled, static swelling until the words became difficult to make out, interference that seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched the rain pounding on my windshield. It's behind you right now. It's been watching you drive. It's waiting for you to look. Then the voice was gone. The static cleared, the normal chatter of Channel 19 resumed, and I was alone in my cab with information I couldn't verify, and a fear that was spreading through my chest like ice water through veins. I didn't look. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around, to confirm that my sleeper was empty, to prove that the voice had been a prank or a fever dream or some elaborate trick played by a trucker with too much time and too little sense. The curtain that separated my cab from my sleeper was inches behind my head. All I had to do was pull it aside, look at the mattress I'd slept on for years, verify that nothing was there, and the voice had been wrong, and I could finish my run without this terror that was making it hard to breathe. But the voice had known my name, had known about Harrisburg, about the unlocked cab, about details that no stranger on a CB channel could have known unless they'd been watching me, unless they'd been there, unless they knew things about my night that I hadn't told anyone. So I drove. 4 hours through rain that never let up, through darkness that seemed deeper than any I'd experienced, through a night that stretched toward a dawn I wasn't sure would ever come. My hands shook on the wheel, sweat beading on my forehead despite the cold, eyes locked on the road ahead because I was terrified of what I might see if I let them wander to the mirrors, to the curtain, to the space behind me that I'd always thought of as safe. I listened for sounds from my sleeper, every creak of the truck settling, every shift of weight that might have been cargo or might have been something else, every noise that I couldn't immediately identify and explain. The rain covered a lot of it, the constant drumming on my roof masking smaller sounds that might have confirmed or denied what the voice had told me. But sometimes, in the gaps between thunder, in the moments when the rain let up enough for silence to creep through, I thought I heard breathing. Not my breathing, something else. Something behind me, something waiting in darkness that I was too terrified to illuminate. Something that had been watching me drive for 4 hours and was patient enough to keep watching until I made the mistake the voice had warned me against. I tried the CB twice more, calling for the woman's voice, asking for more information, begging for someone to tell me what was in my truck and how to get rid of it. The channel stayed normal, other truckers responding with confusion to my increasingly desperate transmissions, no one acknowledging the voice I'd heard or the warning I'd been given. One driver asked if I was okay, if I needed help, if I was having some kind of breakdown that required intervention. I told him I was fine, that I'd been having a bad night, that I was tired, and the storm was getting to me. He said he understood, said we all have nights like that, said to pull over if it got too bad, to get some sleep, to take care of myself. I didn't pull over, couldn't pull over. The voice had told me to keep driving until sunrise and not to stop for anything, and I decided somewhere around 3 a.m. that I was going to follow those instructions exactly, that I was going to trust a warning I couldn't verify over the possibility that something was behind me that I didn't want to meet in the darkness of a rest stop parking lot. Dawn came around 6:30, the sky lightening from black to gray to something that almost resembled day. The rain had stopped sometime in the past hour, the storm finally exhausting itself, leaving behind wet roads and dripping trees and a world that looked normal despite everything that had happened during the night. I pulled into a truck stop, found a spot at the far end of the lot, killed the engine, sat for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, watching the sun climb higher, watching light fill spaces that had been dark for too long, gathering the courage to do what I'd been avoiding for 4 hours. Then I turned around and opened the curtain. The sleeper was empty. No one hiding in the shadows, no figure crouched on the mattress, nothing visible that would explain the terror I'd been carrying since 1 a.m. For a moment, I felt relief so profound it almost made me dizzy, the release of tension that had been building until it felt like it would crack my bones. Then I saw the footprints. They were on my sheets, the white sheets I'd left dry and undisturbed when I'd started my shift the night before. Wet footprints, small ones, child-sized, pressed into fabric that had absorbed moisture and preserved the impression of something that had been standing there, walking there, moving through a space that should have been empty. The prints led from the mattress toward the cab, toward the curtain I'd been too afraid to open, toward the driver's seat where I'd been sitting for 4 hours. They stopped right behind where my head had been, right behind the curtain that had separated us, right at the spot where something had been waiting, had been watching, had been close enough to touch me if it had wanted to. I don't know what made those footprints. Don't know what got into my truck at Harrisburg. Don't know why it waited behind me for 4 hours. Don't know what it wanted or why it didn't take it. I don't know who the woman on Channel 19 was, how she knew my name, how she knew about the unlocked cab and the creature that had climbed inside. I've asked other truckers about it, the ones who've been driving long enough to have heard things that don't fit into the world we think we understand. A few of them have heard the voice too. Not the same message, not the same warning, but a woman on Channel 19 who knew things she shouldn't have known and told them what they needed to hear to survive whatever was happening that night. No one knows who she is. No one's ever met her, never traced the signal, never found a driver or dispatcher who claims responsibility for the transmissions that have saved people from things that hide in sleepers and wait in darkness and climb into cabs that get left unlocked for 5 minutes too long. I lock my truck now. Every time, no matter how quick the stop, no matter how well lit the lot, no matter how many times nothing has happened in all the years I've been doing this. I check my sleeper before I start driving. Check it again at every stop. Check it obsessively in ways that would seem paranoid to anyone who hasn't found wet footprints on sheets that should have stayed dry. And I listen to Channel 19 more carefully than I used to. Listen for static that seems worse than conditions warrant. For voices that break through interference to say things that no stranger should know. I don't know what was in my sleeper that night. Don't know where it went when sunrise came. Don't know if it's still out there looking for unlocked cabs and sleeping drivers and opportunities that present themselves to things that are patient enough to wait for them. But I know it was there. The footprints prove that much. Something was behind me for 4 hours, inches from my head, close enough to touch me, watching me drive through a storm that lasted until dawn. And the only reason I'm still here to tell this story is a woman's voice on Channel 19 who knew my name and told me not to look. I don't know who she was. Don't know how to find her, how to thank her, how to ask the questions that have been living in me since that night. But if she's listening, if she somehow hears this the way she somehow knew to warn me when I needed warning, I want her to know something. I didn't look, and I'm still here. Every trucker knows there are rest stops you use and rest stops you avoid. Places that feel wrong for reasons you can't articulate to anyone who hasn't felt it themselves. You learn to trust that feeling after enough years on the road. Learn that the instinct telling you to keep driving even when you're tired and need a break is usually right, even if you can't explain why. The trucks that feel safe, the diners that feel welcoming, the parking lots where you can close your eyes without spending the whole night listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. You learn to find them, to seek them out, to make them part of routes you drive so often, they become second nature. The rest stop at mile marker 47 in North Carolina was on my avoid list from the first time I passed it. I couldn't tell you what was wrong with it. The facilities looked normal enough from the highway. A small pull-off with parking for maybe 15 vehicles. A bathroom building that had probably been built in the 80s. The kind of basic infrastructure that the state puts up because regulations require it rather than because anyone particularly wants to use it. Nothing about its appearance screamed danger or wrongness, or any of the things that would justify the feeling I got every time I approached it. But the feeling was there. A weight in my chest that started about a mile before the exit, a tightness that made breathing harder, a sense that something was watching from that rest stop, waiting for me to make the mistake of pulling in. I'd been driving that stretch of Interstate 40 for 12 years, had passed mile marker 47 hundreds of times, and I'd never once stopped there. Had never been tempted to stop, had always found the energy to push through to the next rest area or truck stop, had always listened to whatever part of me was saying that place wasn't somewhere I should be. The rainy night in November 2022 was the first time I didn't have a choice. The storm had been building all evening, the kind of system that the mountains seemed to generate out of spite, weather that went from manageable to dangerous in the time it took to travel 20 miles. I'd been watching my gauges, monitoring conditions, planning to stop at a truck stop another 30 miles ahead, where I knew the facilities were good and the lot was well lit, and other truckers would be there to provide the particular safety that comes from numbers. The engine light came on at mile marker 45. Not a gradual warning, not a flicker that might have been a sensor malfunction, but a solid illumination that was accompanied by sounds I'd never heard my truck make before, a grinding beneath the hood that suggested something catastrophic was either happening or about to happen. The power started to fluctuate, lights dimming and brightening in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, and I knew with the certainty of someone who'd been driving trucks for 23 years that I wasn't going to make it 30 more miles. I pulled into the rest stop at mile marker 47 because it was either that or break down on the shoulder of a mountain highway in a rainstorm that would have made rescue difficult and survival uncertain. The parking lot was darker than it should have been. The lights that should have illuminated the space were dead, had apparently been dead for some time based on the darkness of the bulbs I could see in the fixtures. But other things were working. The vending machines near the bathroom building hummed with electricity that cast a pale glow across concrete that was cracked and stained in ways I didn't want to examine too closely. The bathroom lights were on, visible through windows that were too grimy to see through clearly, suggesting that power was reaching the building even if it wasn't reaching the lot. 3 trucks were parked in the spaces designated for commercial vehicles. All of them had their engines off, their lights off, their curtains drawn across cab windows in the way truckers do when they're sleeping. They looked like they'd been there for a while, rain collecting in puddles on their roofs, water streaming down sides that hadn't been washed in weeks or months or longer. I parked as far from them as I could, while still being in the lot, killed my engine because it had started making sounds that suggested keeping it running would cause more problems than it solved, and sat in darkness that was broken only by the distant glow of vending machines and the intermittent flash of lightning that turned the mountains into shadows against a sky that wanted to drown everything beneath it. The engine problems had stopped the moment I pulled off the highway. No more grinding, no more power fluctuations, no more warning lights. I turned the key in the ignition, and the truck started perfectly, ran smoothly for the 30 seconds. I let it idle before shutting it off again, showed no sign of the catastrophic failure that had forced me off the road in the first place. I should have left, should have pulled back onto the highway immediately, should have driven to the next rest stop or the next truck stop, or anywhere that wasn't this place that had been on my avoid list for 12 years. But the storm was getting worse. Visibility dropping to nothing, and I told myself that 4 hours of rest in a place that felt wrong was better than dying on a mountain highway, because I was too stubborn to wait out weather that wanted me dead. Those 4 hours were the longest of my life. I tried to sleep but couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard sounds that didn't fit. Sounds that came from outside my truck, from the darkness of the parking lot, from directions that should have held nothing but empty spaces and other vehicles whose occupants were presumably sleeping. Footsteps on wet pavement that stopped when I sat up to listen. Voices that were too quiet to make out. Conversations happening at distances that should have made them inaudible. Words and languages I couldn't identify that seemed to carry meaning I didn't want to understand. Around 2 a.m., I got out to use the bathroom. Couldn't wait any longer. Couldn't make myself stay in that cab when my body was making demands that couldn't be ignored. I grabbed my flashlight, checked that my phone had signal, even though I knew rest stops in the mountains rarely did, and stepped into rain that hit my face like cold fingers trying to push me back into the safety of my truck. The bathroom was worse than I'd expected. The lights worked, fluorescent tubes that buzzed with the particular frequency of bulbs that should have been replaced years ago. The fixtures were old, stained with rust and something else, something darker that had dripped down walls and pooled in corners and dried in patterns that looked almost deliberate. And the graffiti, I've seen a lot of truck stop bathrooms in 23 years. I've seen crude drawings and cruder words, and the particular creativity that boredom and anonymity inspire in people who want to leave their mark on places that will forget them the moment they leave. But the graffiti in that bathroom wasn't words I could read. It was symbols, painted in something that looked darker than spray paint, something that had texture and depth, and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The symbols covered every wall, wrapped around mirrors I couldn't bring myself to look into, spread across ceiling tiles that had been pushed aside to reveal darkness above them that my flashlight couldn't penetrate. I used the facilities as quickly as I could, didn't wash my hands because that would have required standing at a sink directly beneath symbols that seemed to move in my peripheral vision, and got out of that building with a speed that felt like running, even though I told myself I was walking, that I was calm, that there was nothing in that bathroom except old graffiti and bad lighting, and the particular wrongness that neglected places accumulate over time. Back in the parking lot, I found myself looking at the other trucks. They hadn't moved, hadn't shown any sign of life in the 2 hours I'd been there. No lights coming on, no engine starting, no truckers stepping out for air or bathroom breaks, or any of the things that people do when they're waiting out storms in rest stops. They just sat there, rain streaming down their sides, darkness behind their curtains, silence where there should have been the sounds of people existing. I needed to know I wasn't alone. That was the thought that drove me across that parking lot toward the nearest truck, a Peterbilt that looked like it had been new sometime in the 90s and hadn't been properly maintained since. I needed to hear another human voice, to confirm that other truckers were parked here waiting out the same storm I was, to break the isolation that had been building since I'd pulled in and was now pressing against my chest like a weight that was slowly crushing me. I knocked on the driver's door. The sound was too loud in the silence of the lot, a sharp crack that echoed off buildings and trees and the mountains that surrounded us. I waited for a response, for a voice asking who was there, for movement behind the curtain, for any indication that the truck was occupied by someone living. The door swung open, not because someone opened it from inside. It swung open on its own, the latch apparently not engaged, the weight of the door carrying it outward until it stopped against hinges that groaned with rust. The cab was empty, but the seat was warm. I could feel the heat radiating from leather that had been pressed by a body that had absorbed the warmth of someone sitting there recently, that still held the impression of weight that was no longer present. And in the cup holder, positioned as if someone had just set it down, was a cup of coffee. It was still steaming. I ran. Didn't think, didn't reason, just ran back to my truck with a terror that was pure and absolute. The kind of fear that doesn't ask questions because it already knows the answers won't help. I was in my cab with the doors locked before I'd consciously decided to move, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition, my breath coming in gasps that fogged the windshield I needed to see through. The truck started perfectly, ran smooth and quiet, no grinding, no warning lights, no sign of the problems that had forced me into this lot 4 hours ago. I pulled out of that rest stop and onto the highway without checking for traffic, without looking back, without doing any of the things that safety and experience demanded because safety and experience didn't apply to what I'd just discovered. I drove until sunrise, drove until I was 2 states away, until the mountains were behind me and the land had flattened out and the sun was high enough that shadows couldn't hide whatever was waiting in them. Then I pulled into a truck stop that was full of other drivers, that was well lit and loud, and full of the particular chaos of commerce that felt like safety after the silence of mile marker 47. I told a few truckers about what happened, the ones who'd been driving long enough, the ones who looked like they'd seen things they couldn't explain. Most of them knew the rest stop I was talking about. A few of them had their own stories, brief and reluctant, accounts of engine problems that appeared and disappeared, of trucks parked with warm seats and no drivers, of symbols that covered bathroom walls and seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. None of them could explain it. None of them had answers for what waited at mile marker 47, what caused trucks to break down just long enough to trap their drivers, what happened to the people who parked their rigs and walked away from seats that were still warm and coffee that was still steaming. I've never stopped there again. Never will, no matter what happens to my truck, no matter how bad the weather gets, no matter what mechanical problems suddenly appear when I'm passing that exit. I'll break down on the shoulder first. I'll risk the highway before I risk whatever waits in that parking lot, in that bathroom, in trucks that sit with their curtains drawn and their engines cold and their drivers gone to somewhere I don't want to imagine. The rest stop at mile marker 47 is still there. I pass it every time I drive that route, feel the weight in my chest that starts a mile before and doesn't lift until I'm miles past. Sometimes I see other trucks parked in that lot, different trucks than the ones I saw that night, their lights off and their curtains drawn. I wonder about their drivers. Wonder if they stopped because of engine problems that appeared out of nowhere and vanished the moment they pulled off the highway. Wonder if they're sleeping behind those curtains, or if they've already walked away, already left warm seats and steaming coffee and everything else behind as they went wherever the people who stop at mile marker 47 go. I hope they're okay. I hope the wrongness I felt that night was just exhaustion and fear, and the particular paranoia that storms create in people who spend too much time alone on highways that don't care whether they live or die. But I don't think hope matters much at mile marker 47. And I don't think I want to know what happens to the drivers who learn that the hard way. I picked up a hitchhiker once, only once, on a rainy night when my conscience outweighed my common sense. It's a story I've never told anyone, not my wife, not my dispatcher, not the truckers I've shared road stories with for 28 years. Some experiences you keep to yourself because you know how they'll sound. Know that the people you tell will look at you differently afterward, will wonder if the miles have finally gotten to you, if the isolation has cracked something in your mind that can't be repaired. The night was in October 2018, somewhere in eastern Kentucky on a stretch of Route 23 that cuts through mountains so dark and forests so thick that your headlights feel like whispers trying to be heard in a room full of shouting. I'd been driving since early morning, a long haul that had started in Michigan and would end in Tennessee, the kind of run that requires careful management of hours and energy, and the particular discipline that keeps you alert when your body is begging for sleep. The rain started around 9 p.m., a drizzle at first that my wipers handled without complaint, then a steady fall that made me reduce my speed, then a downpour that felt like the sky was trying to empty itself onto roads that couldn't absorb what was being given to them. I've driven through worse, have spent enough years in these mountains to know that storms come and go, and the best you can do is slow down and pay attention and trust that your experience will get you through conditions that would terrify someone who hadn't been doing this long enough to develop the instincts that survival requires. I saw him at an on-ramp near a town I'd never stopped in, a place so small it probably didn't have a stoplight, just houses and a general store and people who lived there because their parents had lived there and their grandparents before them. He was standing at the base of the ramp with his thumb out, the classic hitchhiker pose that you still see in these parts, where public transportation doesn't exist, and walking is sometimes the only option for people who don't have cars. He had no bag, no coat, no protection against rain that was soaking him so thoroughly, his clothes had become a second skin. Just a man, maybe 50 years old, standing in a downpour that should have sent any sane person seeking shelter, watching my truck approach with eyes that seemed to catch my headlights and hold them. I shouldn't have stopped. Trucking companies have policies against picking up hitchhikers, and those policies exist for good reasons. Stories of drivers robbed or attacked or killed by people they were trying to help, cautionary tales passed around truck stops like warnings about curves and grades, and stretches of highway where cell service doesn't exist. I hadn't picked up a hitchhiker in 15 years, had learned through experience and observation that the risk usually outweighed whatever good feeling came from helping a stranger. But the rain was biblical, worse than anything I'd driven through in recent memory, and the nearest town was 40 miles away, and I couldn't leave someone to drown on the side of the road while I drove past with an empty passenger seat and a heater pumping warmth into a cab that had room for one more person. My conscience, the voice of my mother who'd raised me to help people who needed helping, outweighed the common sense I'd developed in 28 years of driving trucks through country that didn't always reward kindness. I pulled over, rolled down my window, asked if he needed a ride. He didn't speak, just nodded once, moved toward my passenger door with a gait that seemed smoother than walking, and climbed into my cab with water streaming from clothes that were thinner than the October night should have allowed. He settled into the seat, closed the door behind him, and looked ahead through my windshield with eyes that reflected my dashboard lights in ways that seemed wrong, too bright, too focused, too present in ways that living eyes rarely are. I pulled back onto the highway, asked where he was headed, waited for a response that didn't come. He just sat there, water dripping from clothes that were creating a puddle on my floor mat, watching the road with an attention that felt more like observation than navigation. I tried again, asked his name, asked where he'd come from, asked any of the questions you ask, a stranger you've invited into your vehicle because you want to know who you're sharing space with. He didn't respond for the first hour, just sat in silence, occasionally turning his head to look at me, with eyes that seemed to be studying my face, memorizing features, cataloging details that I didn't understand why he'd want to remember. I told myself he was in shock, that the rain and the cold had done something to him, that he'd warm up and start talking once he realized he was safe, once the heat of my cab had driven out whatever chill had settled into his bones. Then he started talking, not responding to my questions, not answering what I'd ask, but telling me things. Things about my route, my schedule, my life that existed outside this truck, and this night, and this rain-soaked stretch of highway in eastern Kentucky. "You're picking up a load in Knoxville tomorrow," he said, his voice flat and even, the tone of someone reading facts rather than sharing conversation. "Machine parts for a factory in Ohio. Your dispatcher's name is Carol. She's worked at the company for 12 years, started as a receptionist before they promoted her." I felt something cold settle in my chest, something that had nothing to do with the temperature in my cab. I hadn't told him where I was going, hadn't mentioned my next pickup, my dispatcher, any of the details he was reciting like he'd read them from a script someone had prepared for this exact moment. "How do you know that?" He didn't acknowledge my question, just kept talking, kept telling me things that no stranger could have known, things that existed only in my daily routine, and the private thoughts I'd never shared with anyone. "You always take the shortcut through Virginia, the one through Lee County that saves 40 minutes but adds stress to your brakes. You worry about your brakes sometimes. Worry that you're pushing them too hard, that they'll fail on a grade someday, and you'll become another trucker who didn't make it home." My hands were shaking on the wheel. The fear that had been building since he'd started talking was now something physical, something that made my fingers tremble, and my breath come faster, and my heart beat with a rhythm that felt like warning. "There's a diner where you always stop for breakfast. Martha's, on Route 11, the one with the red roof that needs replacing. You order the same thing every time. 2 eggs, bacon, hash browns, white toast. Coffee with cream, no sugar. Martha knows your name. She calls you her regular to the other customers." I'd never told anyone about Martha's. It was my secret, my ritual, The one constant in a life of constant change. A place I stopped every time I drove that route, a meal that never varied, a routine that felt like home and a job that took me away from home for weeks at a time. How could he know? How could anyone know details that existed only in my actions and my memories and the private rhythms of a life I lived alone? "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice louder than I'd intended, cracking with fear I couldn't hide. "How do you know these things?" He turned to look at me then, really look at me, with eyes that reflected the green glow of my dashboard in ways that human eyes don't reflect, that shouldn't have held light so completely, that seemed to be made of something other than the tissue and fluid that makes up normal vision. "You're going to have trouble with your transmission next month. The shop in Danville will try to overcharge you. Don't let them. The part you need costs $300, not $800. They'll tell you it's the whole assembly. It's not. It's a solenoid. Stop. Stop talking. I don't want to know these things." You think about retirement sometimes. Think about getting a small place in the mountains, somewhere quiet where you could fish and watch weather come over ridges that have been there longer than people. You've been saving for 15 years. You're closer than you think. I pulled over. Didn't think about traffic, didn't think about safety, just pulled onto the shoulder of a rain-soaked highway and slammed my truck into park with a violence that made the whole rig shudder. I turned to face him, to demand answers, to make him explain how he knew things that lived only in my private thoughts, dreams I hadn't shared with anyone, not even my wife who slept beside me when I was home, and didn't understand why I sometimes stared at mountain horizons with longing I couldn't explain. The passenger seat was empty, just wet. The seat where he'd been sitting was wet. The floor mat was wet. Water dripped from the door handle he'd touched when he climbed in. But he was gone. Had disappeared without sound, without motion, without any indication of departure except his sudden and complete absence from a space he'd occupied for 90 minutes. I sat there for a long time, breathing hard, staring at an empty seat that was still wet from a man who had known my route and my thoughts and my secrets, and had vanished when I demanded to know who he was. The camera. I'd installed a camera in my cab 2 years earlier, after a theft at a truck stop where someone had broken in while I was sleeping and taken valuables I'd been stupid enough to leave visible. The camera ran constantly, recorded everything, provided evidence and security, and the particular peace of mind that comes from knowing your space is documented. I pulled up the footage on my phone, hands still shaking, scrolled back to the moment I'd pulled over to pick up the hitchhiker. The footage showed me pulling over, showed me rolling down my window, speaking to empty air, waiting for a response from no one. Showed me pulling back onto the highway with my passenger seat empty, completely empty, no water, no figure, no indication that anyone had been standing at that on-ramp or climbing into my cab or sitting beside me for 90 minutes while I drove through rain that my camera recorded, but my passenger apparently didn't exist in. The audio was worse. My voice, asking questions, commenting on the weather, making small talk with silence. Then my voice changing, becoming frightened, demanding answers from no one. Then my voice, loud and panicked, telling empty air to stop talking, to stop telling me things I didn't want to know. I was talking to no one, had been talking to no one for 90 minutes, responding to questions no microphone had picked up, reacting to words that existed only in my perception of a night that my camera recorded differently than my memory insisted it had happened. I've tried to explain it, tried to convince myself I was tired, that I'd hallucinated, that the stress of driving and the isolation of the road had finally produced something my mind couldn't distinguish from reality. I've tried to believe that the man wasn't real, that I'd imagined everything, that the fear and the knowledge and the presence I'd felt so clearly were products of exhaustion and nothing more. But the transmission failed next month. The shop in Danville tried to charge me $800 for an assembly replacement. I told them it was the solenoid, watched their faces change, watched them admit that yes, maybe it was just the solenoid, maybe they could do it for $300 if I insisted. And Martha at the diner still calls me her regular, still knows my order before I give it, still has no idea that a stranger who shouldn't have existed knew her name and her roof and the meal I've been ordering every time I drive that route for 15 years. I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore. Don't stop for anyone standing at on-ramps in the rain. Don't let my conscience outweigh my common sense. Don't make room in my cab for people who might not be people at all. But sometimes, on rainy nights when the mountains are dark and the forests are thick, and my headlights feel like whispers trying to be heard, I wonder if he's still out there. Still standing at on-ramps, still waiting for truckers with too much compassion and not enough caution, still climbing into cabs and telling drivers things about their routes and their lives and their futures that no stranger should know. I wonder what he wanted, why he told me about my breaks and my dispatcher and my dreams of retirement in mountains where I could watch weather come over ridges, why he appeared for 90 minutes and then vanished, leaving nothing behind but wet seats and footage that showed me talking to empty air. I wonder if he's still talking to truckers who can't see him, still sharing secrets that don't belong to him, still existing in spaces where cameras can't record and microphones can't hear, and the only evidence of his presence is the knowledge he leaves behind. And I wonder, on the darkest nights, if maybe he wasn't something I picked up at all. Maybe he was something I've always been carrying. Maybe he was just finally ready to speak. There's safety in numbers on Appalachian highways, especially during storms that turn mountain roads into nightmares. Every trucker knows this, learns it early, understands that finding other drivers going your direction in bad weather can mean the difference between making it through and becoming another story. People tell to warn newcomers about the dangers of mountain driving. You follow taillights when you can't see the road, match speeds with someone who's been through these curves before. Trust that the collective experience of multiple drivers will carry you through conditions that would defeat any one of you alone. The convoy I joined that night in March 2021 consisted of 4 trucks, all of us heading south on Interstate 77 through West Virginia, all of us grateful to have found each other in rain that had been falling since before sunset and showed no sign of stopping. I'd been driving solo for hours when I caught up to them somewhere north of Beckley, 3 sets of taillights moving at the kind of cautious speed that suggested experienced drivers who understood what the weather was asking of us. I fell in behind the last one, matched their pace, and felt the relief that comes from knowing you're not alone in darkness that wants to swallow you. We talked on the CB, Channel 19, the way truckers do when they're sharing highway and helping each other through conditions that make every mile feel like a victory. The lead truck was driven by a man who called himself Big Earl, his voice deep and steady, the kind of voice that suggests someone who's been doing this long enough to have seen everything and survived it all. Behind him was a driver named Tommy, younger sounding, eager in the way new truckers are eager before the years wear down the enthusiasm. Third in line was a woman who went by Nighthawk, her voice calm and professional, the kind of trucker who takes the job seriously and doesn't waste words on conversation that doesn't matter. I introduced myself, gave my handle, told them how grateful I was to find company on a night that had been feeling lonelier with every mile. They welcomed me into the convoy with the easy camaraderie that develops between strangers who are sharing danger, the kind of instant friendship that forms when survival depends on cooperation. We talked for hours, shared names and destinations, made jokes about the weather and complaints about dispatchers, and all the normal things truckers talk about to stay awake on long hauls. Big Earl told stories about routes he'd driven in the 70s, before the interstates were finished and trucking meant navigating roads that hadn't been designed for vehicles our size. Tommy asked questions about the industry, seeking wisdom from those of us who'd been doing this longer. Nighthawk offered observations about conditions ahead, updates she was getting from other truckers on channels I wasn't monitoring. The conversation felt normal, felt like countless other conversations I'd had on countless other nights, the particular rhythm of CB communication that becomes second nature after enough years of using it to connect with people you'll never meet in person. I wasn't thinking about anything unusual, wasn't questioning the voices on my radio or the taillights I was following through rain that made everything beyond my wipers feel like a memory of visibility rather than the thing itself. Around 3 a.m., things started to change. The truck in front of me, the one driven by Tommy, took an exit I didn't recognize. Not one of the standard exits with truck stops and gas stations and the infrastructure that truckers depend on, but a smaller exit, the kind that leads to county roads and small towns and places where an 18-wheeler doesn't have much reason to go. I watched his taillights disappear down the ramp, tried to raise him on the CB to ask where he was going, but he didn't respond. His voice, which had been part of our conversation for 3 hours, was simply gone from the channel, as if he'd never been there at all. I told myself he'd decided to stop for the night, that the weather had gotten to him, that he'd found a place to wait out the storm, and hadn't bothered to announce his departure. Truckers do that sometimes, break off from convoys without explanation, follow schedules and routes that don't align with the people they've been traveling with. It's not unusual, shouldn't have bothered me the way it did. 20 minutes later, Nighthawk took an exit too. Same kind of exit, small and unfamiliar, the kind I'd never noticed in all my years of driving this route. Her taillights disappeared down a ramp that seemed to appear out of the darkness and vanished the moment she was no longer on it, as if the exit had been created specifically for her departure and ceased to exist once its purpose was fulfilled. I tried to reach her on the CB, same as I'd tried with Tommy, and got the same response. Silence, absolute and complete, as if her radio had been turned off or destroyed, or had never existed in the first place. Big Earl was still ahead of me, his taillights steady through rain that had gotten worse since Nighthawk's departure. His presence, the last connection I had to the convoy that had been carrying me through this night. I called out to him, asked if he knew why the others had left, asked if he was planning to stay on the highway, or if he too was going to vanish down an exit I didn't recognize. He didn't answer, didn't acknowledge my transmission, didn't respond with the voice that had been leading our conversation for 3 hours, didn't do anything except continue driving at the same cautious speed that had been guiding us through the storm. Then his taillights vanished, not into an exit, not down a ramp or around a curve, or into any of the normal explanations for why lights ahead of you suddenly disappear. They simply stopped existing, one moment burning red through the rain, the next moment gone, as if the darkness had reached out and taken them, had swallowed a truck and trailer and driver without leaving any evidence that they'd ever been there at all. I was alone on the highway. The realization hit me with a physical force, a weight that settled in my chest and made breathing feel like work. I was alone, had been following taillights that were no longer there, had been part of a convoy that had dispersed so completely it was as if it had never formed. The CB was silent, not the silence of truckers sleeping or not transmitting, but a deeper silence, the absence of the background chatter that always exists on Channel 19 when you're anywhere near other drivers. I pulled over, had to pull over, had to stop and get my bearings, had to understand what had happened to the 3 trucks and 3 drivers I'd been traveling with for hours. The rain was still falling, still hammering my windshield, still making the night feel like something that wanted to drown everything beneath it. I sat in my cab, engine idling, trying to raise anyone on the CB, trying to make contact with truckers I was suddenly certain I'd imagined. No one answered. The channel was dead, holding nothing but static, offering no evidence that Big Earl or Tommy or Nighthawk had ever been part of the night I thought I'd been having. I checked my dash cam, the camera I'd installed 3 years earlier that recorded everything, that provided a constant document of my drives, that would show me the taillights I'd been following, and the exits the other trucks had taken, and the proof that I hadn't just spent 3 hours in a convoy that had existed only in my mind. The footage showed me driving alone. Every frame, every minute, every mile since I'd started recording when I got on the highway before sunset. No taillights ahead of me, no convoy, no other trucks visible through rain that my camera captured but that apparently hadn't contained the vehicles I was certain I'd been following. The timestamp showed hours of driving through darkness and storm, hours of a truck traveling by itself, through conditions that should have made me pull over long before I found company that was never there. The CB conversations weren't recorded. The audio from my cab showed me talking to myself, responding to voices that no microphone had picked up, having half of a conversation with people my equipment insisted didn't exist. I could hear my own voice, asking Big Earl about his routes, laughing at Tommy's jokes, agreeing with Nighthawk's observations about conditions ahead. I sounded normal, sounded like a trucker talking to other truckers, sounded like someone participating in conversation rather than speaking into silence. But the other voices weren't there, had never been there, according to everything my equipment could prove. I'd spent 3 hours talking to no one, following taillights that weren't there, part of a convoy that had never existed on a highway. I'd been driving alone since before the sun went down. I looked up the handles afterward. Big Earl, Tommy, Nighthawk. Searched the industry databases, the trucker forums, the records that track who's licensed to drive, and what companies they work for. None of them existed. The handles weren't registered. The company names I'd seen on their doors when I joined the convoy didn't correspond to any trucking companies in any database. The drivers who'd welcomed me into their group had never been documented anywhere, except in my memory of a night that couldn't have happened the way I remembered it. I've talked to other truckers about it since. The ones who've been driving these mountains long enough to have heard things that don't fit into the world we think we understand. A few of them have had similar experiences. Convoys that formed out of nowhere and dispersed just as mysteriously, voices on CB channels that didn't match any registered drivers, taillights that led them through storms, and then vanished when conditions improved. One old-timer told me about convoys that aren't convoys. Said the mountains have ways of providing company when you need it, of creating help when help is required, of putting taillights in front of you, when the alternative is driving alone through darkness that might swallow you whole. He said the trucks aren't real, not in the way we think of real, but they're also not nothing. There's something the mountains offer to drivers who might not make it through without them, something that exists long enough to guide you through the worst of it and then disappears because its purpose has been fulfilled. I don't know if I believe that. Don't know if mountains can create phantom convoys, if taillights can appear when they're needed and vanish when they're not, if the voices I heard on Channel 19 were something the night provided because I was driving through conditions that might have killed me if I'd been alone. But I made it through that storm, made it to my destination, made my delivery, continued a career that has now spanned 30 years of driving trucks through country that doesn't always follow the rules I thought I understood. And sometimes, on nights when the weather gets bad enough, when the rain or fog or snow makes solo driving feel like suicide, I hear voices on Channel 19 that aren't in any database. I see taillights ahead of me that don't match any trucks on the highway, that guide me through the worst sections and then disappear when I reach safety. I don't call out to them anymore. Don't try to make contact, don't ask for handles, don't attempt to verify that the convoy I'm following is made of trucks and drivers who exist in the same reality I do. I just follow the taillights. Trust that they'll lead me through whatever the mountains are throwing at me. Accept the company they offer, and don't question why it appears when I need it or where it goes when I don't. The convoy that night in 2021 wasn't real. I know that now, have accepted that I spent 3 hours following trucks that existed only for me, talking to drivers who were never on that highway, part of something the mountains created because the alternative was dying alone on a road that would have taken me if I'd tried to drive it without help. I don't know what Big Earl and Tommy and Nighthawk were. Don't know if they were ghosts or echoes or something else entirely. Something the mountains have been providing to truckers since before interstates existed, since before trucks existed, since the first travelers tried to cross terrain that didn't want them there and needed help from sources that couldn't be explained. But I'm grateful. Grateful they appeared, grateful they talked me through a storm that might have killed me, grateful that something out there cares enough to put taillights in front of truckers who are driving toward darkness they might not emerge from. The convoy that vanished saved my life that night. And somewhere out there, on highways I haven't driven yet, in storms I haven't faced yet, I think they're still running, still guiding, still waiting for the next trucker who needs them to appear. I've hauled every kind of freight you can imagine in 27 years of driving, and I've learned that sometimes cargo shifts, sometimes loads settle, sometimes trailers make sounds that mean nothing except that physics is doing what physics does. You hear things back there that would worry you if you didn't understand them. The particular groaning of metal under stress, the thump of pallets finding new positions on curves, the creak of walls that are holding thousands of pounds of whatever you've been hired to transport from one place to another. After enough years, you learn which sounds matter and which sounds are just the truck talking to itself, the ongoing conversation between load and trailer and road that becomes background noise to anyone who's been listening long enough. But the sounds my trailer made during a rainstorm in West Virginia in August 2019 weren't physics. They weren't cargo settling or metal adjusting or any of the normal explanations I'd developed over 27 years of hearing things behind me that didn't need to be investigated. They were footsteps. I'd picked up the load in Ohio that afternoon, a warehouse outside Columbus that specialized in industrial equipment, machine parts for a factory in Virginia that needed them for a production line restart scheduled for the following morning. The pickup had been routine, forklifts loading pallets with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this thousands of times, a worker who barely looked up from his clipboard as he handed me paperwork that described the contents in language too technical for me to understand. I watched them seal the trailer, watched them apply the tamper-proof lock that would prove the load hadn't been opened between pickup and delivery, watched them verify the seal number and record it on paperwork that would follow the freight from warehouse to factory. I verified the weight at a scale 30 miles from the pickup, confirmed that the numbers matched what the manifest said they should be, satisfied myself that I was hauling exactly what I'd been told I was hauling. Machine parts. 42,000 pounds of industrial equipment, secured on pallets, wrapped in plastic, documented in triplicate the way everything in this industry gets documented. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious, nothing that should have made the next 12 hours into something I still can't explain to anyone who asks. The rain started somewhere in eastern Ohio, a drizzle that became a steady fall that became the kind of mountain storm that turns driving into a battle you're never quite sure you're winning. I've driven through worse, have spent enough years navigating weather that wanted me dead to know when to push through and when to pull over, and this storm felt manageable, challenging but not dangerous, the kind of conditions that required attention without demanding surrender. I first heard the footsteps around 10 p.m., somewhere on Interstate 79 south of Morgantown. The sound was distinctive, unmistakable, the particular rhythm of someone walking that your brain recognizes instantly because humans have been listening for approaching footsteps since we lived in caves and needed to know what was coming toward us in the dark. Heavy steps, the weight of someone substantial moving across the floor of my trailer, starting at the front where the cab connected and moving toward the back where the doors were sealed. I told myself it was cargo, told myself a pallet had shifted, that something had come loose, that the sounds I was hearing were just the normal noises of a loaded trailer navigating mountain curves. But the footsteps had a pattern to them, a rhythm that cargo doesn't have, a sequence of steps that sounded like walking because they were walking, because something was moving back there in a space that should have held nothing but machine parts and the silence of secured freight. The footsteps reached the back of the trailer and stopped. I could feel them stop, could sense the absence of motion the way you sense when someone who's been moving suddenly holds still. The rain continued to fall, my wipers continued their rhythm, the engine continued its steady rumble, but behind me there was silence, complete and total, the kind of silence that feels like waiting. Then the footsteps started again, back toward the front, toward the wall that separated my trailer from my cab, toward me. The same heavy steps, the same deliberate pace, the same unmistakable sound of someone walking through a space that had been sealed and locked and verified empty when I'd left the warehouse 4 hours earlier. I pulled over, had to pull over, had to stop and think, had to convince myself that what I was hearing had an explanation that didn't involve what I knew I was hearing. I found a wide spot on the shoulder, killed my engine, and sat in silence that was broken only by rain drumming on my roof and the occasional sound of vehicles passing on the highway behind me. The footsteps had stopped when I stopped, had ceased when my truck ceased moving, as if whatever was walking back there was responding to my behavior, was waiting to see what I would do next, was listening for me the way I was listening for it. I got out, walked along my trailer in rain that soaked me within seconds, walked to the back where the doors were sealed and the lock was undisturbed and everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. I pressed my ear against the metal, held my breath, listened for sounds that would prove I hadn't imagined what I'd heard for the last 20 minutes. Nothing. Just silence, just the rain, just the particular emptiness of a sealed container that should have held 42,000 pounds of machine parts and nothing else. I walked back to my cab, climbed in, started my engine, told myself I was tired, that the storm was playing tricks, that the mountain highways were creating echoes and resonances that my brain was interpreting as footsteps, because footsteps were what my brain expected to hear when it heard patterns that sounded like walking. The footsteps started again the moment I pulled back onto the highway. Front to back, the same route, the same pace, the same heavy steps that seemed to be walking a circuit through my trailer with a purpose I couldn't understand and a presence I couldn't deny. They reached the back and stopped, waited in silence that felt like observation. Then started again, back toward the front, back toward me, back toward whatever destination they were walking toward, that apparently required them to pace endlessly through a space that shouldn't have contained anything capable of pacing. I tried talking to it, pulled over again, walked to my trailer, stood in the rain, and spoke to whatever was inside, like a man losing his mind on a dark highway. Asked what it wanted, asked who it was, asked any of the questions you ask, something you're not sure exists, but can't pretend you're not hearing. The footsteps stopped when I talked. Stopped and listened, or at least that's what it felt like, the pause of something that had heard a voice and was waiting to see what came next. But nothing answered. No voice responded. No sound came from behind metal walls. that shouldn't have held anything except equipment that didn't have feet, that didn't walk, that didn't respond to the questions of a trucker who was standing in the rain talking to cargo that couldn't hear him. I drove through the rest of the night with footsteps pacing behind me, learned to predict when they'd start and when they'd stop, learned that they'd walk when I was moving and wait when I was still, learned that whatever was in my trailer was responding to my speed, my movement, my behavior in ways that suggested awareness of what I was doing and decisions about how to respond. I didn't stop again, didn't pull over, didn't sleep, didn't do anything except drive toward a destination that felt like safety, even though I couldn't have explained why a factory loading dock in Virginia would offer any protection against whatever was walking circuits in my big trailer. I drove until dawn started breaking over mountains that had been watching me all night, until the darkness receded enough that shadows stopped feeling like threats, until I could see my trailer in my mirrors and confirm that it looked exactly the way a trailer should look, sealed and locked and carrying nothing visible that would explain what I'd been hearing. The delivery was at 7 a.m., a factory outside Roanoke that processed the kind of industrial equipment I'd been hauling since I started this job almost 3 decades ago. I backed into the dock, waited for workers to appear, watched them approach my trailer, with the casual attitude of people who'd done this countless times and expected nothing unusual from a truck that had driven through the night to bring them parts they needed. They checked the seal. Intact, undisturbed, showing no evidence that anyone had opened the doors since the warehouse in Ohio had closed them 12 hours earlier. They unlocked the trailer, swung the doors open, and began unloading pallets that looked exactly like what the manifest said they should be, machine parts wrapped in plastic and secured to wooden platforms and weighing precisely what the paperwork claimed. I should have driven away, should have collected my signature and moved on to the next load, the next delivery, the next routine run that would let me forget about a night that hadn't made sense and never would. But I couldn't leave without looking, couldn't drive away without seeing the inside of a trailer where something had been walking for 12 hours, where footsteps had paced and stopped and paced again in response to movements and words that nothing inside should have been able to perceive. The trailer was almost empty by the time I walked to the dock, just a few pallets remaining, just enough floor visible that I could see what the load had been hiding all night. Footprints. Bare footprints in the dust that collects on trailer floors over months and years of use. Dust that records whatever passes through it, that holds impressions of feet and wheels, and the evidence of whatever moves across its surface. Human-sized prints, the shape unmistakable, the pattern undeniable, walking a circuit from front to back and back again, hundreds of them, thousands of them, overlapping and crossing and covering nearly every inch of floor that the pallets hadn't occupied. More prints than any single person could have made in 12 hours. More circuits than any single walker could have completed in a night that had only lasted as long as nights last. The dust recorded footsteps that would have taken days to accumulate, weeks, the repeated passage of feet that had been walking that route, long before I'd picked up the load, long before the trailer had been sealed, long before whatever was inside had started responding to my speed and my stops and my voice asking questions in the rain. The factory workers saw them too, stopped unloading, stared at the floor, exchanged glances that suggested they'd seen something they didn't want to acknowledge. One of them asked if I'd had any problems on the drive, any issues with the load, any reason to think something had happened during the night. I told him no. Told him the drive had been fine, the load had been secured, the seal had been intact when I arrived. I didn't tell him about the footsteps, didn't mention the pacing, the stopping, the presence that had walked behind me for 12 hours, through rain and darkness in mountains that had witnessed whatever I'd been carrying without offering any explanation. The trailer was cleaned before I took it for my next load, swept and washed and cleared of dust that had held evidence I didn't want to think about, evidence that suggested something had been walking in my trailer for longer than the trip I'd just completed, longer than the trip before that, longer than anyone wanted to calculate. I still drive that trailer sometimes, still haul loads in the same container that held footsteps I can't explain, that carried something I never saw, that paced through the night responding to my movement and my voice. I listen for the footsteps now, listen on every load, wondering if whatever was walking that night is still there, still walking, still pacing circuits from front to back in a trailer that gets loaded and loaded again, without anyone acknowledging what the dust sometimes shows. I haven't heard them again. Haven't heard footsteps behind me since that night in West Virginia. Haven't felt the presence that seemed to be waiting in my trailer, listening for me the way I was listening for it. But the dust tells stories sometimes. The dust that collects on floors that don't get cleaned as often as they should, that holds impressions of whatever passes through it. I've seen prints in that dust on loads where I know nothing walked, where I know the cargo was sealed and the trailer was empty except for freight that doesn't have feet. I don't know what was in my trailer that night, don't know where it came from or where it went, or why it was walking circuits through a space that should have held nothing but machine parts. But I know it was there. The footprints proved that much. Something walked behind me for 12 hours through rain and darkness, pacing from front to back and back again, waiting when I waited, moving when I moved, present in ways I could hear but never see. And somewhere, in trailers that get loaded without anyone checking the dust, without anyone looking for evidence that shouldn't exist, I think it's still walking. Still pacing, still waiting for someone to stop and listen and ask the questions that it will never answer. I knew Danny Ortiz for 18 years, ran into him at truck stops across the country, shared meals and stories, and the particular friendship that develops between people who understand the loneliness of long-haul driving. He was the kind of man you meet a few times a year, but remember every time you pass through the places you've been together, the diners where you've shared coffee, the parking lots where you've compared notes about routes and weather, and the particular challenges of hauling freight through country that doesn't always cooperate with schedules or safety. Danny had been driving since he was 22, same as me, two young men who discovered that the cab of a truck felt more like home than anywhere else, that the solitude of highways was a comfort rather than a burden, that the life of a long-haul trucker suited something in us that offices and factories and regular hours would have slowly killed. We'd met at a truck stop in Tennessee in 2003, discovered we were running similar routes through the Appalachian Mountains, and had been crossing paths ever since. The kind of friendship that exists in conversations spread across years and miles, rather than days spent in constant proximity. The last time I heard from him was during a rainstorm on Route 52 Inches, Virginia, a night in October 2021 that started like any other night and ended with questions I'll be asking for the rest of my life. I was running a load through Kentucky, heading west while Danny was heading east. Our routes parallel but separated by mountains that usually made CB communication impossible. The storm that night was covering most of the region, the kind of system that sits over the Appalachians and refuses to move, dumping rain on highways that weren't designed for the volume of water that was falling on them. I'd been monitoring Channel 19 for updates, listening to truckers share information about conditions, road closures, the particular hazards that mountain driving creates when weather decides to remind you that you're not in control. Danny's voice came through around 11 p.m., clearer than it should have been given the weather and the mountains between us. I recognized him immediately, the particular cadence of his speech, the way he pronounced certain words that betrayed the Texas childhood he'd left behind decades ago. He was calling for anyone who could hear him, his voice carrying something I'd never heard from Danny before, something that sounded like fear, trying to disguise itself as curiosity. Anyone on 19, this is Road Dog, coming at you from Route 50, 2 north of Bluefield. I've got something here I've never seen before. Anyone copy? I keyed my mic, responded with my handle, asked him what he'd found. The static was bad, the storm interfering with signals in ways I couldn't predict, but his voice came through clearly enough that I could hear every word, could hear the change in his breathing, the way he was trying to stay calm while describing something that was making calm difficult. I pulled over about 10 minutes ago, thought I saw an accident up ahead, lights on the shoulder, figured someone needed help. But it's not an accident. I don't know what it is. What do you mean? What are you looking at? There's lights, but they're not from a vehicle. They're coming from the woods, maybe 50 feet off the road. Blue and white, pulsing, like nothing I've ever seen. And there's something in the middle of them, something standing there. I felt something cold settle in my chest. The particular chill that comes when someone you trust starts describing things that don't fit into the world you've both been navigating for decades. Danny wasn't the kind of man who saw things that weren't there, wasn't prone to imagination or exaggeration or any of the qualities that might make a story like this easier to dismiss. Danny, stay in your truck. Whatever you're seeing, just stay in your truck and drive away. I can't drive away. I can't stop looking at it. There's something about the way it's standing there, something that makes me feel like it wants me to see it, like it's been waiting for me. His voice had changed as he spoke, had taken on a quality I didn't recognize, something distant and distracted, the tone of someone whose attention was being pulled towards something more compelling than the conversation he was having. I called his name, tried to get him to focus, tried to break whatever hold the thing in the woods was establishing over my friend. "I'm going to get out," he said, and the words hit me like a physical blow. "I'm going to get closer, try to understand what I'm seeing. Maybe it's just lights from a house. Maybe it's something someone set up as a prank. Maybe there's an explanation that'll make me feel stupid for being scared." "Danny, don't. Whatever you're seeing, it's not worth the risk. Just drive away. Call me when you're somewhere safe and tell me about it then. I can't leave without knowing. I've driven these mountains for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. I have to know what it is." The last thing I heard was the sound of his truck door opening, the particular click and groan of a cab door that's been opened thousands of times. Then his voice, distant now, speaking words I couldn't quite make out, something that might have been surprise or might have been recognition or might have been something else entirely. Then the transmission cut off. Not faded, not overwhelmed by static, but cut off, mid-sentence, mid-breath, as if someone had thrown a switch and ended whatever Danny had been about to say. I called for him on the CB, called his name over and over, tried every channel I could think of that he might be monitoring. Nothing came back. Just static, just the storm, just the silence of a night that had swallowed my friend and wasn't going to tell me where it had taken him. I called the police when I reached the next town with cell service, described what I'd heard, gave them Danny's location as best I could calculate it, told them that a trucker had stopped on Route 52 and might be in trouble. They said they'd send someone to check, said they'd let me know what they found, said all the things police say when they're trying to calm down someone who's reporting something that sounds impossible. They found Danny's truck 2 days later. It was parked on the shoulder of Route 52, about 15 miles north of Bluefield, exactly where I would have expected based on the transmission I'd received. The engine was still running, had apparently been running since the night Danny had stopped, the fuel tank nearly empty after 2 days of idling beside a highway that had been closed intermittently due to flooding. The doors were locked from the inside. Danny wasn't there. His keys were in the ignition, his wallet was on the dashboard, his phone was on the passenger seat with a half-composed text message to his wife that said only, "I'm sorry I looked." His coffee was still in the cup holder, cold now but positioned as if he'd just set it down and intended to pick it up again. Everything in that cab suggested a man who had stepped out for a moment and planned to return immediately, who had left his belongings and his vehicle and his life waiting for him while he investigated something that had caught his attention, but he never came back. The police searched the area around the truck, searched the woods where Danny had described seeing lights, searched the highway in both directions, searched with dogs and helicopters and everything they could mobilize, for a trucker who'd vanished on a night when visibility had been nearly zero, and conditions had been bad enough that anyone could have gotten lost in the darkness. They found nothing. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no evidence that anyone had left that truck and walked into woods that held nothing but trees and darkness and whatever Danny had seen pulsing blue and white in the rain. I drove to the spot a week later, after the rain had stopped and the roads had cleared and I could stand where Danny had stood and try to understand what had happened to my friend. The shoulder where his truck had been parked was unremarkable, just asphalt and gravel and guardrail, the kind of pull-off that exists on every mountain highway because engineers know that drivers sometimes need to stop. The woods beyond were thick but not impenetrable, the kind of forest that covers these mountains in every direction, that's been here since before anyone thought to build roads through it. I walked into those woods, walked maybe 50 feet, the distance Danny had described between the road and the lights he'd seen, found nothing but trees and undergrowth, and the particular silence of a forest that's decided not to share its secrets with visitors who haven't earned the right to know them. But I felt something, a presence, a weight, an attention that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The feeling that I was being watched, that something in those trees knew I was there and was deciding whether to reveal itself or remain hidden. I walked back to my truck, drove away from that stretch of Route 52, and haven't been back since. Danny's wife calls me sometimes, asks if I've heard anything, if any other truckers have reported seeing him, if there's any possibility that he's still out there somewhere, alive, waiting to be found. I tell her what I can, which isn't much. Tell her about the transmission, about the lights he described, about the way his voice changed when he talked about going to investigate. I don't tell her about the text message. Don't tell her about those 5 words that were the last thing her husband ever wrote, the apology that suggests he knew something was wrong, that suggests he understood the danger, but couldn't stop himself from looking at something that demanded to be seen. I'm sorry I looked. I think about those words constantly. Think about what Danny saw in those woods, what drew him out of his truck, what was waiting for him in lights that pulsed blue and white, in a rainstorm that should have made any lights invisible. I think about the way his voice changed during our last conversation, the way he described feeling like the thing in the woods wanted him to see it, like it had been waiting for him. I think about the fact that they never found a body, never found any evidence of what happened after Danny walked into darkness that refused to give him back. Some truckers say the mountains take people sometimes, say there are things in these forests that have been here longer than the roads, longer than the towns, longer than anyone can remember. They say the lights Danny described have been seen before, have been drawing people into the woods for as long as anyone's been driving these highways, have been waiting with patience that humans can't comprehend for the next person who'll stop and look and make the mistake of getting out to investigate. I don't know if that's true. Don't know if the mountains are hungry, if the lights are bait, if Danny walked into something that's been consuming truckers for longer than any of us have been alive. But I know he's gone. Know that 18 years of friendship ended on a rainy night because my friend saw something he couldn't explain and couldn't leave without understanding. I know he's sorry he looked. And I know that somewhere on Route 52, in woods that refuse to give up their secrets, something might still be pulsing blue and white in the darkness, waiting for the next trucker who sees lights on the shoulder and makes the mistake of thinking someone needs help. I hope they keep driving. I hope they don't stop, don't investigate, don't make the choice Danny made on a night when curiosity cost him everything. I hope they learn from what happened to my friend, but I know they won't. I know truckers will keep stopping when they see something strange, keep investigating when they should keep driving, keep walking into darkness because that's what we do, because helping people in trouble is part of who we are. And I know the mountains will keep taking them, one by one, into lights that pulse like something alive, into forests that don't return what they're given, into whatever Danny found when he stepped out of his truck and walked towards something that had been waiting for him all along. I'm sorry he looked, and I'm sorry I couldn't stop him.